So first off, to all the Canadian Forces members in the room, it's now time to wake up because I'm going to be talking about the Canadian Forces, and I'm happy to tell Dr. Wong that the manner in which we get our driver's license is a little different in Canada, so I hope we're not more dangerous 18-year-olds, but I do resonate with a lot of what you said, and I think it goes perfectly in line with what we're looking to do with our diversity strategy. So first off, Major General Hetherington, Major General Rouleau, KCIS organizers, thank you for giving me the opportunity to come here today and talk to you about how the Canadian Armed Forces have used diversity with the implementation of our strategy. You know, we've heard a lot in the last 2 days about military capacity and how it's based on the strength of our people. And that really is the idea behind the diversity strategy, is that value that we place in every individual that contributes to our organization. So my goal here today is to talk to you about why the diversity strategy was created, what we've created, and then give you an update on some of the initiatives that we're currently looking at. First off, why it was created. I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room how diversity can affect mission success on operations around the world, whether it be in Afghanistan, Haiti, evacuation of refugees. We've all seen the value of having different perspectives on operations, and I know Darleen's going to touch on that a bit further in her presentation. We also need to look at the societal changes that are happening in our own country. We know that 50% of the workforce is made up of women. We know that 1 in 5 Canadians are immigrants or have parents that were born abroad. And we know that that number is increasing. A study that was conducted in 2013 shows that the 3 largest visible minority groups in Canada, be it South Asian, Chinese, and those of African descent, have little to no interest in joining the Canadian Armed Forces. In fact, it's their least preferred career option. So somehow we need to do a better job of marketing ourselves and attracting that labor pool, because we're limiting ourselves to decreasing the amount of the Canadian society that we're recruiting. We have very clear direction from the Government of Canada, most recently with the release last week of the defence policy, where diversity and our people are front and center in the defence policy. One of my favorite quotes in the defence policy is that our global engagement is guided by Canadian values of inclusion, diversity, compassion, and respect for human rights. So it's very clear that our government is behind us in the implementation of this strategy. Now, the goal behind the diversity strategy is to move away from our compliance-based model. However, we can't negate our responsibilities in terms of being compliant with the Employment Equity Act. As a federal employer, we have obligations to set long-term representative rate goals for our 4 designated groups. For us, that would be women, Indigenous peoples, visible minorities, and people with disabilities. You can see from the slide that we are falling short in those goals, and so we need to be cognizant of that, and that's another reason for the requirement of the strategy. So what did we implement? So a logic model was used to develop the strategy, and you can read the vision as it's depicted on the screen. But for me, what it really says is that we are a mission-focused organization where everyone feels they can contribute as their own identity. And I often get asked the question, or when I took this position, it was, well, you're a female combat arms officer. You must get this. And I took a bit of offense to that. But as I thought about it more and more, I do get it. Because, you know, here I am, a lieutenant colonel in the artillery, definitely a male-dominated institution, but I've never felt that gender had anything to do with my abilities in moving forward. I've had great mentorship from individuals like Chief Warrant Officer Beaudry, who's in the room, where my gender was never a question. It was more about my competence. So I do understand the value of authenticity, the value of feeling that you can contribute as yourselves, and that's the idea behind this strategy. It's based on 5 foundational principles. One, that we need to be reflective of Canadian society. Our Chief of Defence Staff says that this is an institutional imperative for the Canadian Armed Forces. Major General Rouleau just spoke about how the characteristics of warfare are changing, and that is also true from a Canadian Armed Forces perspective, and how we see that very small parts of our organization can make a big difference. In certain aspects, we value physical fitness, but we also value tenacity. We're looking for analytical skills. We're also looking for problem-solving skills. We need to be able to demonstrate and allow people to explore all the strengths that they bring to the fight. If we look at, I've already spoken about value-based, so this is the idea of compliance-based. In history, it's always been about counting our numbers, looking at our statistics, looking at our representative rates. And as I indicated, we still have to look at those obligations, but what the strategy is doing is taking us beyond that and making all of our numbers count. Leadership commitment, like any strategy, this isn't going to work if we don't fully embrace it and get behind it. And that's leaders at all levels, not just our senior leadership, but transcending all levels of leadership, so that's clearly an aspect of leadership commitment that needs to be respected. And finally, merit-based standards. As a professional military institution, professional competence is #1. And nothing in this strategy is indicating that we want to bend or lower our qualification standards that we currently have. So just to give you an idea of some of the initiatives that are currently ongoing, in terms of our first goal, which is understanding the culture, you know, we have to be cognizant of the fact that as military members, we're socialized to think a certain way, we're socialized to act a certain way, and sometimes it's difficult to recognize our own biases. So that's why we're working on really leveraging external research in forms such as this, also working with our communication and security establishments to form diversity tiger teams to learn best practices, but also working with our private sector. Later this month, with the help of Canada Company, there'll be a strategic exchange on increasing diversity in the Canadian Armed Forces. So we're leveraging as much external research as we can on this topic. We're also working with our incredible team of defense scientists internal to the Canadian Armed Forces to explore areas of research that we haven't delved into. One example is the LGBTQ2 community in the Canadian Armed Forces. We've never really approached that community to determine what their needs are. We've never really asked the questions as to how best to approach them and how best to, or what their needs are. So that's something we are exploring this year. In terms of the second goal of inculcating the culture of diversity, we're not suggesting here that we need to completely overturn our Canadian Armed Forces culture. What we're more trying to do is enhance our culture to include diversity and make sure that it's fully embraced. Part of that will be an exercise of validating our code of values and ethics. Do our values continue to represent what we want them to? Can all Canadians align with them? Are there aspects of our values, modifications that need to be made to make more Canadians align with them? Or is it just the matter of how we communicate our values from the start of one's military career right to the end? I would argue, I think it's more the latter. In terms of modernizing our Canadian Armed Forces identity, we're talking about messaging. General Rouleau mentioned how we need to modernize our message to Canadians, and it's the same in the conventional force. As well, we're looking at incorporating gender perspectives and the Government of Canada model of gender-based analysis plus in everything we do, whether that's our dress, our protective equipment, our infrastructure. We need to do a better job of seeing the different perspectives in all of our procedures. We also need to do a better job of educating our leaders on their obligations in terms of accommodating our members. As federal employers, as Canadians, we all have rights under the Canadian Human Rights Act in terms of being accommodated against the 11 grounds of discrimination. A number of frontline leaders do not understand our obligations in that regard, and so we need to do a better job of educating them and explaining to them the difference between our point of undue hardship and what it would be in a civilian company. And the last thing I'll say about Goal 2 is just strategic communications, because I think this is quite crucial. I'm proud to say that we're going to be creating a diversity and inclusion champion to act as that strategic voice for this portfolio, but it goes further than that. And if I take the LGBTQ2 community as an example, the message has always been, I don't care what your sexual orientation is because it has no bearing on your operational effectiveness. But I would suggest that that narrative needs to be modified. Your sexual orientation may not affect our operational effectiveness, but I do care about you as an individual and I care about your identity. It's a small nuance, but I think it's important that demonstrates the change in the strategic factor that we need to do. In terms of the third goal in modernizing our policies and procedures, when we see that our policies and procedures do not fully enhance diversity, we need to make some changes. We've done a lot of work the last couple of years on updating our religious and spiritual accommodation departmental directive. We've also working on updating our management of our transgender member instruction. And one other initiative I'd just like to point out is we're also looking at implementing a national sort of peer support initiative for LGBT community. And this was based on the needs that were determined at the ground level. Bases were getting on board and already doing this, so this is something that we need to bring up to the national institutional level. And finally, in terms of the fourth goal in generating a CF that reflects Canadian diversity, if I could change, the strategy was already in place before I took this position, but if I could change one aspect of the strategy, it would be this. I think the word should say sustain. I think it's great to be able to generate policies and strategies of this nature, but if we can't sustain it, then we'll lose all the momentum we've already started to build. So I think it's crucial that we look both at the start of a career and all the way through. And there's a lot of great work being done. Major General Heer talked about it yesterday in terms of our recruiting and attraction, re-looking at our career management and how we see a career in the forces and being more flexible in our approach. And finally, a mentorship program. This is something that has been challenging to implement. The way we view mentorship, whether it's one-on-one, one-on-many, many-to-many, I'm not quite sure how best to define that, but mentorship's done very differently across the organization depending on the color of the uniform that you wear, depending on the unit you're in, and we're trying to look at a way that we can institute a framework so that all individuals have someone they can turn to for guidance and advice. And finally, let's see here, the way forward. So the way forward, the slide sort of gives you some of our hard benchmarks in terms of the Tiger team that I'm a part of. We actually have a remit due to the Privy Council's office in terms of our shared best practices on diversity. The action plan lays out exact timelines that all L1s need to follow. But for me, the way forward is really to take this strategy from the strategic level and the senior leadership level and have it transcend through every level of our institution. And I'm fully cognizant that this is not something that can happen overnight. We're talking about complex issues. We're talking about reshaping our way of thinking. So this will take time and it'll also take commitment. But I'm confident that with the leadership that we currently have at all levels that we can achieve it. So thank you.